Young teacher, the subject of schoolboy fantasy. He wants her so badly, knows what he wants to be. Inside her, there's longing. This boy's an open page. Bookmarking, he's so close now. This boy is half her age. Don't stand so close to me. Don't stand so close to me. Yeah, it's a tasteless opening, but I'm sticking to it. Cheers. Hey, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the new movie diary in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. Well, I didn't do my usual double feature this week, but I do have the privilege of devoting this episode more or less exclusively to one of the best films I've seen all year. But before we get into that, let me just do a quick roundup of 3 other recent films that I've seen in the last week or so. First up is Polaris. This is an independent and decidedly very low-budget post-apocalyptic fantasy film written and directed by Canadian filmmaker Kirsten Carthew. It premiered at the Fantasia International Film Festival last summer, but has only just gotten a video-on-demand release at the beginning of this month. The film stars Viva Lee as Sumi, a feral, one-eyed girl whose sole companion is a polar bear with whom she survives peacefully in the new Ice Age climes of the Northern Americas about 120 years in the future or so. Sumi and her bear follow the trail of a bright pink northern star that Sumi can apparently communicate with using some vague artifact she wears on her wrists, but she ends up being separated from her ursine surrogate when her first ever encounter with other humans, a group of jet ski riding loggers, leads to her being captured and brought back as a freak captive to their fort. Ruthlessly killing one of her captors, though, Sumi is able to make her escape. She also demonstrates some rather impressive magical powers when she tears out the eye of the one she killed and places it in her own eye socket, and apparently the eye is totally usable now. And though the story more or less follows Sumi's attempts to be reunited with her companion, Sumi herself does not speak except in animal noises, and every other language in the film is invented and presented without subtitles. That is, save for the narrator of the story, who Sumi encounters under some very mysterious circumstances that don't get much clearer even by the very end of the film. I should probably also mention that Polaris is cast exclusively with women actors. There's apparently nary a man left in this desolate world and its few human communities clinging to life, and it's definitely an interesting choice, though I'm not going to pretend that I necessarily found much about Polaris much more than interesting. Though Carthew's vision is highly imaginative and engagingly unpredictable, Polaris never really overcomes its paper-thin budget, especially to the extent that its action sequences are neither terribly well choreographed or shot or edited together. There is something to be said, though, for that interesting factor to Polaris. This is a very original and a very weird film that, like a lot of post-apocalyptic fantasy films, owes no small debt of inspiration to George Miller's Mad Max films, except that Carthew is one of the few filmmakers overtly inspired by Miller who goes farther than simply mimicking the kind of post-industrial, customized DIY costume prop and set design that have now become so much a part of his iconic imprint on fantasy cinema. Rather, Carthew deserves credit in terms of actually telling a fantasy story in a way that Miller might, which is to say that, despite its obvious limitations, the main way that Polaris keeps our interest is through this mythopoeic building of the world that these characters inhabit, and as the movie goes on, we increasingly come to the realization that the film itself is not being presented as a straight fantasy story from the point of view of its protagonist. It is is rather being narrated to us as a legend or myth that in and of itself alludes to a perspective that is outside of the story and a way of seeing the world that we don't quite apprehend or have access to, and the possibility that, far from really trying to figure out everything that's on screen in a narrative sense, we're really supposed to sit in the headspace of that imagined perspective and experience it as its own kind of sublime mystical spectacle. Now, I don't necessarily think that Polaris is all that terribly successful in that regard, but the interest and weird factor definitely goes a significantly long way to making this a much better than average B post-apocalyptic fantasy, even if it's not that much better than your average B post-apocalyptic fantasy. So for that, I'm giving this one an impressive 2.5 out of 5. Next up is La Gravite, the latest film from French Bernicabe filmmaker Cédric Ito, and honestly, there's some interesting spiritual parallels between this and Polaris, though Ito's film is a work of near-future speculative fiction rather than a post-apocalyptic fantasy. There's a spiritual connection in that La Gravite is also the sort of movie that basically plunges us into a world that operates by a lot of implied rules of engagement that it doesn't spend very much time telegraphing to us through a clear audience cipher. Instead, we once again slowly become acquainted with the strange mystical contours of this story that takes place, in this case, in and around a low-income apartment block in the Parisian suburbs. The film stars Max Gromis as Daniel, a former drug dealer who has gone straight and is now torn between his budding career as a professional runner and his girlfriend, who wants them to leave with their child for Canada. Even still, though Daniel wants no more to do with the drug game, he feels indebted to a childhood friend, Joshua, played by Steve Tienchu, who was paralyzed from the waist down in some obscure incident when Daniel and he were still children. Daniel wants to go straight, but he continues to assist the wheelchair-bound Joshua in selling drugs, which ends up running afoul of the younger breed of teenage hoodlums who now run the block. Also failing to take heed of the new Jack's swing of things is Christophe, Jean-Baptiste Newman, Daniel's former friend and partner, as well as Joshua's brother, who finishes his stint in prison and now holds a lot of animosity towards Daniel, both because of the additional time he served by not ratting on him, and because he holds Daniel personally responsible for the crippling of his brother. All of these conflicts occur against the backdrop of the impending alignment of all the planets in the solar system, which seems to be having all sorts of implied effects not only on the Earth's gravity, but also upon the mental states of the various characters who inhabit this story. And though I don't think the climax of La Gravite is anything to especially write home about, this is another in a long line of films this year that is a victim of some really rather uninspiring action and fight sequences. I certainly found myself very attracted to how, even after all its buildup, Ito seems to be content to almost pull the rug completely out from under us. This is not a science fiction film in which we have a lot of explicit world-building preparedness for where the story is going. Rather, Ito devotes much more of the film to studying these three characters in much more ordinary ways, albeit against a rather extraordinary backdrop, and to such an extent that the climax of the film really does somewhat come out of nowhere. The film really only reveals the scope of its bizarre, speculative imaginings by the end, so without spoiling too much, I'll say to keep an eye on that teenage gang and take heed of any time someone in the film stresses how, no, these kids really are way different than the previous generation of petty criminals. They've got something way more eccentric philosophically going on with them that is meant to pay off with a bang only at the very end of the picture. It's far from a perfect movie, and again, I don't know how technically successful that climax ends up being, but I will say that as a more understated mood piece and a character study despite its genre trappings, I really found myself being highly engaged by not only the film's three quite good leading performances, but also the surprisingly intuitive and free-willing way Ito goes about subverting our expectations of what the story of La Gravite is going to be. I especially like a lot of the stuff involving Christophe's attempts to reintegrate into criminal life in his old neighborhood. There's frankly a lot of really well well executed, darkly comedic, darkly farcical stuff that I think should have probably been more of the movie. But I digress. La Gravite is a quite good film. I hope more people end up checking it out and it gets a boost in word of mouth from here. I'm personally giving it a 3.5 out of 5. And finally, there's MANGALAVAARAM, a Telugu language film directed and co-written by Ajay Bhupathi that's basically part murder mystery and psychological thriller, albeit filtered through a lot of the conventional features of Indian commercial cinema. This is another Indian film I'm seeing this year with a really large ensemble cast, a bombastic or operatic tone, and a really convoluted plot structured around 2 long acts that, once again, I didn't get to appreciate as intended because this was yet another American programming of an Indian film at a major chain multiplex that blew right through the intermission. You can't do that. The intermission is part of the movie. And this was actually a really promising movie at first. Basically, the plot is that there's this provincial village where one day graffiti is discovered on a wall claiming 2 members married to different people have been having an affair, and then the bodies of those 2 villagers are discovered dead, apparently having poisoned themselves in a murder-suicide pact. But a week later, on the same day, there's some new graffiti claiming another case of infidelity and 2 more dead bodies in another apparent murder-suicide pact, and so it appears to be that there's a serial killer loose in this village whose modus operandi is to expose and punish the adultery and hypocrisy of the people in the village. It gets a lot more complicated than that. Again, this is a very convoluted ensemble piece, and there's a whole extended opening that takes place 10 years before the events I just described that doesn't pay off until the intermission break. There's also a recurring motif regarding the veneration and incarnation of the goddess Mahalakshmi, how she's invoked and represented throughout the film as both a symbol of grace and as well as a symbol of vengeance. There's a figure who we see at the prelude to all of the deaths who might be the killer, who seems to specifically disguise themselves and pattern themselves after Mahalakshmi. That stuff I tended to find very evocative and atmospheric. Honestly, Bhupathi's direction is rather interesting. There's an extent to which he's entirely conventional in terms of the more maximalist, go for broke with everything approach of Indian commercial filmmakers, but at the same time, you also see a more pronounced degree of visual experimentalism. I especially like certain scenes or shots of night photography, which have very minimal lighting sources, sometimes even just the flames of torches or fires that Bhupathi will frame in these wide canvases of otherwise complete blackness. There's this almost otherworldly avant-garde aspect to stretches of MANGALAVAARAM that I think really helps facilitate a sense of dread and disturbance, even when other aspects of the movie are a little too conventional and overstated to sustain that feeling. At the same time, this movie starts off very promising, and though it's undeniably salacious, it's quite good when you're in the mindset of still thinking that it's engaging in a meaningful exploration of sexist hypocrisies of provincial life, the story unfolding to sort of interrogating the contrast between how people present on the outside and how they carry on behind closed doors, as well as disparities in terms of how men are given room to be licentious, whereas women are treated as merely adulterers. But with the second act, it basically just devolves into one strained and unearned twist after the other, and with a lot of extended flashbacks to boot. Not only does any tension or interest in the mystery plot itself basically go up in smoke, it also basically loses track of any dramatic insight. What starts out seemingly like a story that really picks apart these contradictions and hypocrisies latent in the sexism of such a traditional and surface-oriented society just ends up being another maudlin, one-dimensional moral parable that can't even seem to sustain a credible sense of the various characters in this story in terms of how they are presented and then what is revealed about them. Often in a really patronizing reversal where the only impact it has is to make the story more complicated, but not to actually make it more exciting. I guess I'm still on the lookout for this year's great commercial Indian film, but I'm giving MANGALAVAARAM a 2 out of 5. But the main event for today is May December, the latest film from director Todd Haynes, a filmmaker whose impressive career goes all the way back to the 80s and early 90s when he rapidly established himself as one of the true revolutionaries of the independent film movement in America, mounting a series of controversial and subversive cult classics, including Superstar, The Karen Carpenter Story, Poison, and Safe. In successive years, Haynes' penchant for formal experimentation and provocative studies in characters living simultaneously on the outskirts of social norms, but also at the center of popular fascination, has led him to turns of rather fascinating extremes in his works. Whether we're talking about the highly interpretive pop decadences of Velvet Goldmine and I'm Not There, his elaborate homages to glam rock and David Bowie on the one hand and Bob Dylan in the case of the latter, or occasionally more tonally subdued and romantic works like the lesbian drama Carol from 2015, or even his more arguably conventional recent output in the cases of both the legal thriller Dark Water from 2019 or his documentary film about the Velvet Underground from 2021. Though often polarizing, Haynes' films are almost always just as aesthetically exciting as they are often conceptually and narratively unpredictable. When you see that name attached to a film, you're never quite sure what you're gonna get, and while his latest film is far from either his more formally radical works, it sees Haynes continuing his track record of exploring the lives and worlds of characters who are sometimes incredibly difficult to identify with, access, or empathize with, all the while layered with challenging allusions to the role that pop culture itself plays in arranging and bounding our senses of the world around us and our place within it. May December stars Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore, the latter of whom has already appeared in a number of films by Haynes, including Safe, Far From Heaven, I'm Not There, and most recently Wonderstruck. Portman plays an actress named Elizabeth Berry, who travels to an affluent, scenic suburb of Savannah, Georgia, in order to do research for her starring role in an upcoming film based on true events. Julianne Moore plays Gracie, the woman who Elizabeth will be portraying. Now in her 50s, Gracie is married to and has had 3 children with Joe, played by Charles Melton, who is only in his early 30s. Clearly inspired by the true crime case of Mary Kay Letourneau, we learn that Gracie first met Joe 20 years before when the latter was just 13 and was a student in the same school at which she taught. While the two later worked together at a pet store over that summer in the late 90s, Gracie began a sexual relationship with Joe that, upon exposure, became a media and tabloid sensation. Gracie spent 7.5 years in prison, at which time she gave birth to her and Joe's first child. Upon her release, the two married and started a family, and by the time Elizabeth comes into the picture, one of their kids is already in college, while 2 more, a pair of fraternal twins, are just getting ready to graduate high school. Though hospitable to Elizabeth, Gracie and Joe are both guarded and suspicious about her and the intentions behind this film being made about their relationship. It turns out that this film Elizabeth will be in isn't even the first time their personal lives have been mined for demoralizing sensationalism. We do at one point watch a brief clip from a previous trashy made-for-TV dramatization of their affair. They are naturally wary that even 20 years on, this new project may once again reignite hostility and social ostracization against them, despite both Gracie and Joe's maintaining, outwardly anyway, that their relationship was consensual. Elizabeth sticks it out, though, assuring them that she just wants to present a nuanced, humanizing portrait of who Gracie really is. But as the film goes on, this tripart character study not only starts to tease apart lies and half-truths that Gracie and Joe tell Elizabeth about their relationship, past and present, but to also interrogate the nature of Elizabeth's own dramatic investigation of these real-life people, which is itself increasingly portrayed in some decidedly creepy and perverse ways. May December is written by Sammy Birch, who is here making her debut as the screenwriter of a fiction feature film after a long list of credits primarily as a casting assistant and casting director. With May December, Birch manages to burst onto the scene with a truly excellent piece of screenwriting, but also one that seems to channel her particular experiences. While it's never too overt in the film, May December, besides the more straightforward aspects of its plot and its themes of grooming, deviant sexuality, celebrity, and popular controversy, all prime conceptual real estate for a director like Todd Haynes. Besides all that, it's also very much a movie about performance. On the one hand, there's Elizabeth, a character who is ostensibly coming to this deviant relationship from the real world and to thus act as a kind of cipher for the audience's own more objective view of Gracie and Joe's history and marriage, and yet who we increasingly become aware of as being the character from which we are actually the most alienated and come to know the least intimately. It isn't long after Elizabeth spends more and more time with Gracie that we become aware that Portman is not just portraying a character who happens to be an actor, but is portraying an actor who is increasingly mimicking and interpreting the affect of the real-life Gracie, the woman she's going to portray. This is all accomplished rather subtly and I would say brilliantly by Portman, but in yet another great film from this year dealing with themes of sexual grooming, the other two, of course, being Palm Trees and Power Lines and Priscilla, a substantial amount of the dramatic tension of May December is actually manifested by our lack of assurance about Elizabeth more than anyone else. Just as we start to feel that we are actually getting to know Gracie and Joe more as real people, we start to feel pulled away from the extreme lengths to which Elizabeth goes to get in the mind of her subject, which includes going to the very pet store in which Gracie and Joe first began their affair and asking to be left alone in the stockroom, only for us to watch as Elizabeth does this solo pantomime performance as Gracie having sex with the unseen and underage Joe, leading us to wonder if the pleasure that she displays and the cathartic laughter she experiences is merely performance, or if in some sense she really is getting turned on by this fantasy. There's this one particularly amazing sequence that sees Elizabeth going into this local high school where she's been invited to talk to the senior acting class, and as she's walking through the halls and Haynes films things very deliberately so that we're seeing just how many of these teenage boys are not only making eyes at Natalie Portman, I mean, who wouldn't make eyes at Natalie Portman, but are very visibly trying to attract and show off to her, and then showing Portman's amusement by this and being flattered by this sexual attention, and of course implied how she's kind of coming to understand almost too intimately how Gracie could be attracted to the idea of an affair with a minor, how flattering it can be to have that kind of attention, how empowering it can be as an older woman, but it all just sort of gets wrapped up in that tension of like, okay, so is this Elizabeth really getting into the head of her character, of Gracie, or is this just another layer of revelation to us of who Elizabeth already actually was, of her own glibness, of her own sort of perversity and deviance that has nothing to really do with the particulars of why Gracie became attracted to Joe and not just teenage boys as like a sexual fantasy that Elizabeth is having. There's even a part of the movie where Elizabeth is on a phone call with the director of the film she's going to be in, having reviewed audition recordings of various teenage actors who could portray Joe in the film, and telling her director that they need to find an actor who's sexier. At which point, the director wraps up the scene by simply saying, "I think you need to come back." Even he seems to sense that she's getting a little too close, to say the least, to her subject on this one. And it's a really thorny question because on the one hand, Haynes and Birch are doing something really brilliant here, which is basically insinuating that the deviant sexuality of someone like Elizabeth, who has never acted on, to our knowledge, a sexual attraction to a teenager, that because it's so bound up in total fantasy, that there's the potential that that character's sexual pathology is potentially more deviant and more threatening than a character like Gracie, who did something wrong wrong and deeply unethical, but where the idea is that at least by getting acquainted with those characters, with Gracie and Joe, we become reminded that it is an ethical concern. Whereas for Elizabeth, and presumably the makers of the film she's going to be in, these things are just swirling around in this soupy miasma of repressed desires and perversions. And so what is worse, honestly, if Elizabeth is going down this road merely because she's getting too close to her subject, if we're not seeing the real her, or is it worse if, no, this is just who she is, deep down, and the dramatic investigation of Gracie, just like for all of us at home watching a trashy made-for-TV movie about deviant sex and true crime and forbidden love, or the very Mary Kay Letourneau case, is it worse that that's just who we really are deep down, that this is all just an excuse for us to be aroused by erotic fantasy in a way that doesn't actually teach us anything really important in terms of lessons about the humanity of the victims of sex offenses, as much as it dehumanizes everybody, makes everybody simply a vector for this erotic spectacle, where we more or less completely obscure the basic ethical question, merely the question of what is right and what is wrong and what our personal and social obligations are, completely obscures that and just makes it about sex. So that's a big source of underscoring tension and disturbance to May December. Not so much just the provocative nature of Gracie and Joe's relationship and their personal history itself, but these persistent questions we have about Elizabeth, and not just the extent to which we can trust her interpretation of Gracie, but really to what extent we can trust her reality, the person who's appearing in front of us as anything other than a series of affects where we start to realize that we're losing almost all sense of the original person who we were introduced to at the beginning of the movie. And speaking to the screenwriter's experience, there's an extent to which Birch's screenplay works very well, and more well than a lot of similarly minded films, as a satire of professional acting and the nature of professional performance itself. All of these pretenses of getting to know the character, getting in the head of the character, losing yourself in the character, embodying the character, especially of real-life figures. But it's also balanced by Birch's equally brilliant interrogation of Gracie and Joe's own performances in their personal and social lives. Obviously, in spite of what they say or the affect they present to people, there's a lot more going on in not only their relationship than simply an unconventional one that society deemed deviant. And again, I'm not just talking about the obvious ethical undercurrent of the thing, on which front, it must be said, even compared with Portman and Moore's stellar performances in this, Charles Melton does an amazing job as Joe, and just as much as anything else, this becomes a movie about a relatively young guy realizing for how long his own personal life has basically been an elaborate performance, this strange facade dictated by these almost ephemeral expectations. First, again, not too overtly, but first, that sort of implied sensationalism and this double standard about how it's not as bad for a teenage boy to have sex with an older woman as for a teenage girl to have sex with an older man, as if teenage boys are somehow naturally more sexually pursuant than teenage girls, or even well into their relationship, these expectations of how a man is supposed to be stoic and responsible for his wife and kids, all of which is captured so subtly in both writing and performance, but which is inevitably contrasted with that strange duality of Joe's relationship with Gracie as both husband and quasi-son, as both masculine authority, but also kind of this perpetually passive subject to whatever it is that Gracie wants. And there's, of course, this tension in Elizabeth's dramatic investigation of Gracie and how much we can trust her, how much of her own performance is authentic or simply histrionic and manipulative. But quite frankly, I think the best thing that Haynes and Birch accomplished with May December is that they managed to take this sensationalistic true crime subject with all its baggage and, in some ways, even play directly into its trashiest TV movie implications. The score by Marcelo Zarvos is great because it's practically incidental. It's kept mostly to these very brief, often quite sudden, and very over-the-top cues and stings that you immediately associate with a kind of trashy TV movie adaptation of a true crime or a forbidden love story like this, but where the content at its center is much more tongue-in-cheek and even to a certain extent seems to be more Elizabeth's motif than anything else. That's another great undercurrent of the film, our curiosity as to whether Elizabeth really is working on a serious dramatic project, or if she's merely deluding herself to the fact that she is just playing a stock character in another trashy TV movie about true crime and forbidden love. I kind of got ahead of myself there, but my point is that a lot of what I think is really exciting about May December, both in terms of how much tension and dread it threads, while also being really wickedly funny at times and deeply devastating at others, it all comes down to the fact that Haynes and Birch take this sensationalistic true crime subject right up to the edge of something genuinely unseemly and trashy, but then pull back just enough for us to get these really profound glimpses into a world of these characters who are all kind of engaged in these elaborate performances and sometimes full-blown delusions. And out of it all ending up being a very serious movie that not only handles the theme of grooming of a minor rather tastefully, even in this rather extraordinary, pulled from the headlines example of it, but also manages to do a really effective job of satirizing how the sensationalism of our popular culture, not unlike Elizabeth with her shallow affect of purely artistic and human interest, can really dehumanize people to an extent that it actually, despite Gracie's fear of further ostracism, actually reinforces and normalizes these deviant cases because they're so sensationalistic. The spectacle engineers and reinforces the allure in a strange way, and in the case of Gracie and Joe, actually kind of grossly transforms these normal people into reluctant celebrities and reality performers of a drama in which it isn't just that Gracie has committed a crime and needs to serve her debt to society. No, it's that she really is vindicated in her experience of this forbidden love, this love that transcends all social bounds, and that everybody has to admit that they played it up sensationally. They got off on it just as much as she did. This is a really excellently written, beautifully shot, multi-layered, very meaty production with a really good slate of performances from major to minor parts. I'm going to give May December my highest recommendation and a 5 out of 5, only my second 5 out of 5 of the year, and presently vying for my favorite film of 2023. With that, I'm going to close things out. Another happy Thanksgiving to you all. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.